Hey guys, I got a lot of requests to do my favorite books that I read this year, so I'm just going to list off my top 10 favorite books of 2020 and why I like them. So at number one, there's Finding Flow, which is a book by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and it's where he applies flow psychology in a more like practical sense, so he tells you how you can apply it in your own life. I found it very, very interesting. It was very short also, and I really liked his initial book about flow psychology, but it was more kind of talking about studies and giving examples. This was more getting into like the nitty gritty of like how you'd pursue flow in your life. And he talks about like the fact that a mountain climber doesn't make the goal of like reaching the top of the mountain in order to reach the top of the mountain, but they use these goals as an excuse to go mountain climbing. And I just thought that was a very kind of insightful and easy way to think about the idea of autotelic goals. The second book that I really enjoyed at the start of the year is called The Path, and it's based on a Harvard course that dives into Eastern philosophy. There's a lot of really good stuff in here, and I actually made an entire video about it earlier this year. So they talk about the good life a lot, and kind of the ancient Chinese sort of definition of what the good life is, and they also go into like moral training and the practice of mindfulness in order to deal with like personal relationships and also figuring out like what you want to do with your life. The one really good kind of section that I remember is talking about that instead of going into life thinking you could do anything, you should think more so that you don't know what you're capable of yet. So it's not limiting, but it's also telling you that, you know, you can't do everything, but there is a lot of self-discovery yet to occur. The third book is At the Existentialist Cafe by Sarah Bakewell. This book was just really fun to read. It recaps the beginnings of existentialism. It talks about phenomenology. It also dives into Heidegger and his whole kind of flirting with fascism, totalitarianism, how much it played into his own philosophy. And it talks about Sartre and Camus and their relationship, as well as Sartre and Beauvoir, and it talks quite a bit about Beauvoir, and I definitely want to make a video on her. I find her philosophy very interesting. The fourth book is a very relevant one. It's called The Plague. Before this year, it was a Camus book that I actually hadn't read before, and it was literally because I thought it wasn't a very relevant plot. I think it's actually the best example in a literary sense that Camus gives of what the absurd is, and the character of Dr. Ryu is a very good case of someone who applies absurdism into their ethics and their day-to-day life. He talks a lot about how he's not trying to like save people in the plague based off of some sort of higher principle, like he wants to go into heaven or God or even logic or reason, but he literally just wants to limit human suffering. And I think that that's just like it was just a very noble and insightful depiction of pragmatism and Camus' sort of idea of the absurd hero or absurd rebel. And it's a good book. It's a very interesting book. The way that he depicts the sort of social behavior in the town as this plague is occurring is something that's very relevant, I think, to how we've seen a lot of other people handle the current times. The fifth book is The Defining Decade by Dr. Meg Jay. This was relevant to me because I'm in my early 20s, and she discusses a lot of things that you hear a lot about in other instances, but usually in a more cliche way. She uses a lot of psychological research and her own sort of examples with her clinical work with adolescents and teenagers and young adults to discuss personal relationships, how to figure out what you want to do with your life, and the whole idea of identity capital. And I know a lot of my subscribers are around they're around their 20s, so I would definitely recommend it. It's a light read. The sixth book is After Theory by Terry Eagleton, and it is a very heavy read, I'd say. It dives into the whole history of postmodernism, deconstructionism, and then his whole argument is that these sort of fields of philosophy don't really dive into the deep questions in life about love and death and meaning. And I don't totally agree with everything he says, but I think that it's a very insightful book, and a lot of the arguments he makes, he does so in a very humorous and kind of lighthearted way, while still sticking to a very honest and concise sort of view of these different fields. Number 7, we have Leonardo Da Vinci, the biography by Walter Isaacson. Isaacson also wrote biographies on Steve Jobs and Ben Franklin, I think, and a few others. This one I just really am finding a lot of fun reading. It is very, very detailed, and it goes into like every little part of his life, but in a very kind of fun and comprehensive way. And I think the main takeaways from this book that stick to me especially are the idea of science and art being integrated. He had a very kind of sort of integrative mind, and he was a self-educated Renaissance man, of course, so he was always trying to find patterns, and he always believed that everything was related to each other in some way. There was connections everywhere. So a lot of his like work would involve human anatomy, physics, math, and it wouldn't matter if it was a science project or art. He just took it very seriously in a very sort of autotelic sense. Number 8 is Every Time I Find the Meaning of Life, They Change It by Daniel Klein. This is a very fun, light read. It's about it's written by an 80-year-old philosopher who, when he was younger, he kept a record of all these different philosophy quotes that he really liked, and now he's like revisiting them, and he's kind of writing what he kind of thinks about each one of them. So he tackles a lot of deep stuff, like kind of hedonism versus trying to find a more meaningful life that's beyond pleasure, dealing with death, dealing with the regret, the existence of God. And he does it all in a very light, humorous way. There's lots of jokes in there, and he relates a lot of it to his dog, which is endearing. So that's a fun book if you like philosophy and you don't want to go too deep into it. The 9th book is actually from me trying to learn French. It's called The Little Prince, and I'm sure a lot of people have read it before. I read the French version. This is not to say that I understood every single page. I'm probably gonna have to reread it, but from what I got, and it is a classic, and I can now see why, is that it really talks about light-hearted, fun, childlike things and relates them to kind of heavy themes, so an adult can read this and also find it very insightful. And you have like a main character who is very passionate and curious, and they don't understand why adults are so kind of closed-minded and like limited, and the book's just so imaginative, and the illustrations are so nice, and it's also just a very good book to read if you're just trying to learn a second language, because the language isn't too complex. But I'm definitely going to give it a second read. Okay, and the 10th book is Origin of Species by Nico Ricci, who is a Canadian author, I believe, and it's another fiction book. It is about a grad student in Montreal in the 80s, and he wants to write a thesis about human nature, and he goes on a trip to the Galapagos. And I had actually originally read this in high school and had completely forgotten about it, and then it just dawned on me that this book that I had read so long ago had almost like subconsciously laid a path towards like where I was in my life now. As in, I am studying in like Montreal now. I'm interested in like human nature, the human condition, regarding studying psychology, and also just the fact that he also ends up going to the Galapagos Islands, which I happen to also travel to. And there's a lot of things in that book where I can relate to it personally. It's a very special book to me, and it grapples with a lot of very kind of dark issues like mental health related depression, as well as it talks a lot about postmodernism, deconstructionism, and it also talks about evolution and the importance of stories. And it's very beautifully written. The characters feel very alive. And that would be, I guess, the final book in my top 10 list. I hope you guys go and read at least one of these. They were all very impactful. I read a lot of other ones, didn't quite make the list. There's also a bunch of them that I'm reading now still. I usually read a bunch of books at the same time. But these are the top 10. So thank you for watching, and Happy New Year's.